Okay, so here's a very bare bones explanation of how meditation and mindfulness practice can help with addictive behaviors and some of the judgment issues and impulse control. So every single sensation from the body goes up the backside of the brainstem through the cerebellum. This is more like fine motor. So it goes through here, and then it comes up and it does some communication through something called the thalamus. And then it goes right here to the sensory cortex. And what the sensory cortex does is it tells us there is something happening, and through this area and this area, the thalamus and the sensory cortex, it'll also distribute out to vision, to hearing, to taste and smell. It'll distribute out to all these different areas to pull up memory or patterns. Like, I've smelled this before, that smells like a water moccasin, oh no, danger. Or I've smelled this before, this smells like when my mom used to bake cookies, and then we get that warm feeling in the heart. So after a sensation comes into the sensory cortex, it transfers over into the motor cortex. And everything that's motor comes back down the front side. So it's back for the sensory, and it's front for the motor. Now, that gap between sensation and motor has been referenced. One of my friends is a Navy SEAL, and they call that gap the emotional intelligence gap. This is the gap that's engaged during meditation and mindfulness practice, because between every action and reaction, between every sensation and reaction, there's a gap right there, that momentary gap. And most of us have experienced it where something happens and we go, I probably shouldn't do this, but we end up doing it anyway. That's that gap. We recognized it, but now we're going to try to take control of that gap. So what does that have to do with addiction and addictive behaviors and personality? Well, the prefrontal cortex is part of the frontal lobe. In the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe, we can't reach the brain directly. So what we can do is touch things next to it. And an author named Norman Deutsch, he wrote the book, The Brain That Changes Itself. Dr. Norman Deutsch, The Brain That Changes Itself. And he really dives into the concept of neuroplasticity. And one of the terms is the nerves that fire together, wire together. So the importance of engaging this gap is, if we're down here and we're sitting peacefully and there's a fly that lands on our arm, we could go, or there's an itch. We could do that, or we could say, that's a fly. Acknowledge it and let it go. We know it's not going to hurt us. Or we could acknowledge that we're itching, left hand itching, and then let it go. What a lot of people fall into during meditation and mindfulness is we catch onto a thought and then we dive into that hole. So it's like, I'm sitting here and all of a sudden it's like, I forgot to pay the electricity bill. Man, how much money do I have in the bank? If I don't have enough bank, am I going to be able to pay That's the kind of thought process as we start to dive into the rabbit hole. When we do that, engage that gap by saying, thinking, and let it go. This area right here, the prefrontal cortex, is responsible for our higher mental functions. And that includes things like concentration, planning, judgment, emotional expression, creativity, inhibition. And that's where addictive behaviors and impulse control come into play. So when we exercise this gap right here, and instead of doing that, we acknowledge it, we're inhibiting the motor response, which fires the neurons right in this area, which can help us with those behaviors. So the first time I noticed it myself, I was actually in Afghanistan, and there was a young lady that was probably 10 years younger than me, and I distinctly remember I had been practicing mindfulness and meditation in Afghanistan because I needed it. And she really, really made me mad. And instead of blowing up the way I normally would, I distinctly remember going, I'm mad. But instead of blowing up, I just thought, I'm mad. But I don't have to make this situation worse. So that it's not going to come immediately, but with practice, you'll notice that you're able to engage that gap before reacting. And here's the thing. If you notice it, it becomes easier to notice it in the future. When you notice it, it becomes easier to engage it and not react, because that sensation and action, there's that gap. And that's where we can make a choice.